Welcome to the Find My Catalyst podcast. We all have problems we're looking to solve, and we know that there are solutions out there, but we struggle with this. How do we find the solution? Where does that nudge come from to help us take the next step to start solving tough problems? The intention of this podcast is to help you find your catalyst and take that next step. I'm Mike Simmons. I'm the founder of Catalyst Sale. Today, I am joined by two friends and folks that have been on the podcast before. Jeff Bajorek and Christie Walters join me. Let's get to the conversation. Jeff, Christie, it is awesome to see you and give everybody an opportunity to hear you again. It's been a while since you've been on the podcast. You've been on a couple of different times. We did some kind of home and home type things back with the Why and the Buy and the Catalyst Sale podcast way back. And so
that's been a couple of years though, 18? Mike, hasn't it?
It is. I can't remember. I'm lost. Like time is, as Einstein said, time is relative. And lately I feel like I live in a time vacuum. What year is it?
It's 2022 currently, as we're recording. I don't know when people in the space-time continuum are actually listening to these things, but right now I'm speaking to you as we speak in the now. And we're in 2022.
So how excited are you both about 2022?
Pretty damn excited.
Why?
I have a level of clarity and focus that I've not had in a long time. And it's progressing further as we speak. And it's hard because it's hard to accomplish that level. And Mike, before we started recording, you were sharing with us some of the stuff that's on your whiteboard that no one listening can see, but just kind of, iterating through and diagramming out. And I know that whiteboard has been erased countless times and you've started over, and that is a really difficult process, which is why most people don't do it. I can tell you that's why I didn't do it for a long time. I refused to make some decisions about focus, and it wasn't really, and I knew that there was always, I really should have been doing it the whole time, but you find excuses to make that seem plausible enough for you to move on without doing the things that you need to do. And it was really over the course of most of 2021 where I really started investigating and then slowly, surely kind of taking things apart so I could understand what was necessary and important, going forward. And it's continuing through January of 2022, where we are right now.
Why do you think people struggle with this stuff?
I don't know. Christie didn't. Christie, why didn't you struggle with it?
Well, I'm not sure I have the focus and clarity that you just described.
How do you know that Christie didn't struggle with it?
So,
Why look at her? All she
Christie,
does.
Why do you think Jeff said you haven't struggled with this?
All she does is steamroll through every goal she's ever set, and she lives a tremendously fulfilling life with her husband, and she has access to her grandkids that she sees regularly. And every time I talk to her, she's scuba diving somewhere else, and she's working for a killer company, leading a team, delivering great results. Like,
life is good. I have to say,
she's got it figured out.
Yeah, but Christie, is that just above the waterline?
It is. Yeah. Thanks, Mike. I have some depth there. No, it's interesting. I'm always excited about the new year. The new year is always just I guess I'm just wired this way, but I've always loved the reset of the calendar. I love starting with a new planner. And yes, I still have at least a monthly paper planner for all of our tech geeks out there. I do have everything else electronically, but I like to write things down on paper. But 2022, I got to tell you, it was not the same start for me that I usually, or at least not the same feeling that I normally have at the beginning of a new year. Part of that might have been that I was in the middle of the ocean in the Bahamas on a sailboat when the new year, the calendar switched, and I didn't really allow my brain to get into that mode until like last week. And then I felt like I was way behind. So I think, 2021 was a COVID recovery year for me and my family. I think it was we're sick and tired of being, relegated to home, and we're ready to travel. And when I looked at our finances at the end of the year, I'm like, oh, wow, we might need to dial that back just a little bit. But we did have some amazing experiences, and we connected with people that we felt we had lost connection with a little bit in 2020. And we kind of forcefully moved out into the world, COVID be damned, right? And so I'm so grateful for all of that. 2022 for me is actually going to be more of a year of dialing back. When I look at my goals, the only goal I set for myself this year is that I have to set aside thinking time. I can't continue at the pace that I have tried to operate in for the last several years. My brain, I don't show up as my best self if I don't give myself that thinking time. There's so many amazing things that are that are possible and in the works, but none of it makes any sense if I just don't have space. Mm-hmm. So I'm excited. I am excited about 2022. So don't take any of that as me being down on the new year. It's just a different experience for me this year than it has been. And I'm purposefully doing less.
It actually gets me excited because I think one of the ways that we can simplify, well, if we talk about complexity in the context of adding new things to stuff, mm-hmm. then if we're going to simplify things, we have to take things away. And people really struggle with the idea of taking things away. So as Jeff was talking about creating this level of focus, pre-2022 Jeff, or late 2021 Jeff, it was really easy to say, yeah, you know what, I can do that. I can do this thing. And then before you know it, you're doing so many different things that you're not giving yourself the time, the freedom, the energy to focus on, one, the things that bring you a lot of value, two, the things that can make a much stronger impact. And that thinking time is critical for me. And Jim Collins, in his foreword to The Effective Executive, talks about not trading creative time for other types of time. It's basically, the long and the short of it is block time for your most effective activities and stop what you would not start. So if you take both of those things together, you've got to create space so that you can be creative, not continue to take on things, and be real okay with the idea of letting a bunch of stuff go. So Christie, as you go through the struggle or the comfort of letting things go, just turn on that Frozen song and listen to it over and over again.
Let it go.
Sing.
My granddaughter's 5. I have lots of experience singing that song.
That's awesome.
And that's exactly where we were with the Why and the Buy.
Yeah.
It was September? No, late August, early September. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Probably right after Labor Day, we were having a conversation and I said, Christy, do we renew ourselves for a 6th season? And you said, and at that point, I knew that we were both kind of in the same headspace. Yeah. And that could have just been you perceiving the origin of that question.
Well, what? You've asked that question every year, though, right? And I so appreciate you as a partner doing so, because I'm not sure my personality, I'd slog it through, right? I'd just keep going. And I knew that sometimes it's so much better if you can stop while things are still great. Mm-hmm. That podcast, every moment of it, I'm so incredibly proud of what we produced, what we created, and what will continue to be out there in the podcast first, whatever that looks like, long term. Mm-hmm. But, I'm so grateful to have a partner who said, hey, I know this is great, but is it still serving the purpose that we want it to serve? If it's not, is there a new purpose? And if there's not a new purpose, should we honor it and let it go? Mm-hmm. And I think that's really where we both were.
Yeah, we came to the decision where, you said it and then I said it.
Yeah.
Where it was, if we were to start right now, I don't know if it would look the way it does right now. Mm-hmm. Given where I want to go 5 years after we started this, is not entirely the same direction. So does it even make sense to continue to do this way? And so many people, I've gotten 3 different kinds of comments from people afterward. And some people have given me more than one of these. And the first reaction was, are you sure you want to do that? Yes, we thought about this for a long time. Okay. Wow. Congratulations for letting that go. We know how difficult that must be, but really cool to go out on a high note and let it go the way you did, because you recognize that your your priorities have shifted. It's a really tough thing to do. So those first two comments are kind of rooted in the same origin. And the last thing was those last 2 months were killer.
They really were.
And they were.
Really were. Yeah.
And so not only did we, I think, honor ourselves, honor the show, but we left by doing our best work.
Yeah. So true. I think back to, for those that weren't listening to the podcast at the time, we did a private send-off for anyone who registered at the end of the year after the podcast had finalized or finished. And I still to this day can remember the picture on my screen of all of these amazing faces that have been such a critical part of our lives the last 5 years. And Mike, you were there. I'd humbled was a word that came out, but just in awe of this community and this family that has grown with us over the years. And not all of them were guests. A lot of them were past guests. Some of them were just, people that have listened to us over the years and grown with us in the podcast. And I don't know. It has to be one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. And, obviously the relationships continue on. These friendships continue on, but the work itself, it felt like it just was a real big wow moment.
It's pretty cool to hear you both speak about the impact it had on you while also knowing the impact it had on others and seeing the impact that it had on others in the way that people showed up for the send-off. When you started 5 years ago and you're just starting to hit record and just starting to get this stuff out there, what were your expectations? How long did you plan on doing it? What did you think at the beginning when you started this whole thing? What were the expectations like? What were you thinking about? What was the plan? How did it change? And how does it compare to where you ended? So I know that's a bunch of questions, but I'll just give you guys a chance to talk with each other.
You want to start?
I was going to ask if you wanted to start. I think I want to say we committed to a year at first.
Mm-hmm.
I don't recall writing that down or saying anything. I want to also say with slightly more confidence that in the back of my head, 5 years was a really round number. And I don't remember saying, okay, now it's been 5 years, it's time to give it up or anything like that. But I don't know why 5 years seems more significant to me than 4 or 6 or 10 or whatever. Anyway, I think we committed to giving it a go. I think we committed initially to a year, like I said, and then every year toward the end, it was, okay, are we going to do this again? And 5 years was long enough to get through the learning curve. I think probably 2 years was probably long enough to get through the learning curve. Years 3, 4 were we were riding the wave really well. And then I think year 5, I don't know that I can't blame it on COVID. I can't blame it on anything. I think we both started to realize that this thing may have, run its course. And so we decided that. I think the commitments that we made were to do our best work. We're to give it everything we can. We're to give it everything we could. We're to be coachable. And, I don't think either one of us likes to show up with less than our best, but it was, Mike, I don't know if we had any real expectations as much as it felt like it was really worth continuing, and it was. And then the longer we did it, the more we realized there aren't very many shows that are out there, sales related business podcasts that go that long. I mean, there are the stalwarts that are out there and they're full-time businesses, right? That's why they're still out there. Ours was not. Ours was a hobby. I don't know. And that might be, I don't
That's right. I don't think a lot of people realize that. Yeah.
But I don't, we had a hobby podcast for 5 years because we're not business partners. We were sharing the expense.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
But we were not business partners in this. So yeah, I think that's what I recall. Christie, what about you?
Yeah. So I remember, and we talk about this in kind of our lessons learned on the podcast too. So there might be a little bit of a redundancy here, but I remember when we talked about before the podcast really became what it is today, we were just having great conversations as colleagues and new business owners or fairly new business owners and trying to work through, a lot of challenges. My biggest challenge was that I did not feel comfortable with my writing structure. I haven't been a journaler for most of my life. It was something that I was very self-conscious about. And I was growing a coaching business. And I was like, how do people get to know me if they don't already know me? Mike, you've talked about before that you're not a content guy. You're not the marketing guy. I'm definitely not marketing. I'm sales. I'm not marketing. So I was struggling with how to do that as a solopreneur. And then, Jeff and I would have these hour-long conversations. And it's like, gosh, if people could just hear this, wouldn't that be cool? And that's really all it started out to be.
That was it.
It was just these conversations. And so I learned so much about myself through that process. And honestly, I'll tell you, and Jeff knows this, that when I went back into the corporate world, it became my time was squeezed, right? It was a lot harder to kind of show up and be prepared and be in the right headspace for a Monday morning discussion. But I didn't want to give up that structure and that, I used to call it my Monday morning mastermind, right? I got a chance to sit down with Jeff, who is one of my favorite people in the world, and another brilliant brain, and just talk about business and sales and leadership and the things that we're struggling with and the things that are working and the things that are not. And I'm like, well, gosh, how am I going to create that in my life if I don't have this in place? So that's part of the reason it took me a while to kind of really come to terms with, okay, yeah, I think this is the right time to let this be done. But that's what I remember, is that we didn't care about the audience because we honestly didn't believe we were going to get one.
No.
We had no clue. We didn't know what we were doing. We were producing everything. Believe it or not, I was the social media captain. So that's comical for anyone who follows me on social media. And Jeff was responsible for audio. And we just did the best we could, right?
Mm-hmm.
Based on the information that we had. We did a lot of research. We took an Udemy course on how to produce a podcast. And the rest, I guess, as they say, is history. But what it became was I didn't envision.
Mm-mm. We certainly didn't set any records in terms of downloads, but we
held
got
our
way
own.
More than a lot of podcasts get at the same time. And, you see the Brene Browns and the Joe Rogans and the titans out there in the podcasting world. And it's like, oh yeah, podcasts, they get millions of downloads. And you're like, man, we got like 500 an episode. And you don't realize that that's a lot until you realize, until you learn that, most podcasts don't get more than 100, 150, per episode.
Mm-hmm.
And even some really, really good work. So we knew that we were reaching people. And, as Christie mentioned before, you don't realize the big impact until a small handful of those people actually come out of the woodwork and stop you in the hallway at a conference or send you a message on LinkedIn or come to your, finale Zoom call celebration kind of thing. But we never did it for the downloads.
Yeah.
We'd use the data occasionally, say, is this working? Is this not working? Sometimes we went against the data, but it was just, it was never about becoming famous. It was always just about our own journeys, our own knowledge, our own networking, and, having really good discussions with people we looked up to.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, that the episodes that didn't do well, the episodes that we vowed not to continue doing were, and it's funny, as I say this out loud right now, those people who were, placed on our podcast because we responded to a cold email from a booking agent or something like that, they didn't do well because those weren't people we looked up to. It wasn't that they weren't valuable people, but we didn't have any skin in the game as far as that relationship was concerned. We didn't have any true curiosity. It was kind of like,
the depth wasn't there.
And there was no continuation after that. And so when I think about that real purpose of that, it was to connect with people that we really looked up to.
Mm-hmm.
And we did that with some people more than once. And it was really valuable.
A couple of themes came up as you both were talking. One was around learning curve and working through things to get really to kind of when I hear you say it, I think of find footing, get comfortable, start to build process, create consistency. And can you talk a bit about the learning curve? Specifically, Jeff, you said 2 years. There's this 2-year learning curve. Where did the resilience and persistence come from to continue to keep pushing through, even at those 1-year checkpoints, while you're still just kind of trying to figure, although things are working, you're still trying to figure things out. What was the nudge? What kept you moving through the learning curve?
I'm going to say something trite at the beginning, and I'm going to say that I saw value in the process.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that doesn't mean much to people. So I'll be more specific now, if that's okay. Producing the show myself, going through the audio, going through and the verse, it's probably close to the first year, doing the editing and editing out the hiccups and the ums and the clearing your throats and all this other stuff. And it's really akin to watching your own sales calls come back. Like, you pick up on a lot of stuff, and it was excruciating. But I recognized at the time that there was value in that. So I kept doing it. And then I started seeing the people that recognized the show and would talk about it and would just mention that it was, a good show. And that kind of kept it going too. Like, it was clear to me that we were onto something. And then, so once we had the dynamics of a show around and we dropped our production notes, and we decided to just kind of find our own footing. And instead of scripting the questions that we wanted to ask, we let the conversations breathe. And then I think what happened right around year 1 was we hired a producer. And then the producer showed us, he didn't really produce us, he produced our show. So the first year was really about finding out who we were and how we wanted to make this show go. The second year, I believe, was about how to make the show sound really good and how to tie it all together into something that felt a little more professionally produced. Because we took the course and it's like, okay, here's how you stitch together the sound and blah, blah, blah. And look how easy it is. And okay. But I think between years, the end of year 1, the beginning of year 2, I think was when we kind of grew up and matured as a show. So there was always something to be learning. And then by the end of year 2 into year 3 and maybe a little bit into year 4, it was like, hey, it's probably time for a new mid-roll, probably time for a new intro, probably just kind of polishing what was already there. But there was, I think, just such a growth stage between those first couple of years. And in terms of my gear, in terms of my mic discipline, in terms of the, setting up the environment. Christie, you built out a podcast studio in your house for sound control and things like that. Like, those were little flourishes,
Right.
at the end. But the beginning was really, what do I sound like? What do I want to sound like? Does this sound natural? You grow up from painting by numbers into, just doing full on watercolor on canvas. And that was kind of where we are. But I think along the way, I saw growth, even though it wasn't where I wanted it to be yet. And we just kept pursuing it.
Yeah. So I'll speak a little bit more to kind of the resilience associated with kind of just the partnership. And I think for me, this would have been really challenging to do for the number of years that we did if it were only one of us. Because when one person's energy drops, the other one lifts to fill the space. And there were times when, I might connect with a guest and Jeff didn't, or vice versa. Right. So a lot of that resilience and consistency was built because we had the partnership. And I think that's so critical to always have somebody that, one, kind of checks your, if you're really harsh on yourself from a critique perspective, to have somebody who provides that softer perspective. Or if you are kind of dialing it in, somebody that says, hey, can you step it up here? Or can we do something a little bit different so that it feels more authentic? That a partnership. And I think too, Jeff and I have not been afraid to say anything to each other. I mean, we've always been very kind, of course, but we both had a stake in the success of this. As a side note, I will say, because you mentioned something about, kind of walking the halls of a conference and having somebody come up to you. I had a friend who actually is fairly new to our podcast and was asking me some questions about, well, how did you, how'd you get into it? What was your first aha moment in it, in the experience? And I said, when I went to my first outbound conference and I walk into a room and someone looks at my badge and they were like, the why and the buy. And I go, holy crap, seriously? You know who I am? Like that was like, and that didn't happen that often, but still it was like a blow me away kind of moment. And that realization that it was, I think up until that moment, it was valuable for Jeff and I, regardless of who listened through the podcast stream. And then for clients that we brought on, that was content that we could provide to them. But that realization that just by having the podcast in place and producing that content, that there were people that were getting value on a weekly basis. And there are people in my organization, actually, I'll give a shout out to Mark Anderson, who is really the catalyst. The reason that I joined Convergent Technologies is he has been a podcast listener from day one. Day one, he's been listening to this podcast. And it wasn't like, Mark and I we knew each other in the industry, but we were not best of friends. It wasn't like, we were talking every week or anything like that. But he would literally call me once a quarter and be like, oh, I listened to this. I heard you say this. I heard this interview. This is what I took away from it. This was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. Those little nuggets, and there were only a handful of them over the years, but those little nuggets really help to reinforce that resilience for both of us. And we would always share, Mike, this, but anyone who's ever had a podcast, you put all this stuff out there, you put all this energy, you're raw in some cases, and it's very much you out there in the universe for people to do whatever they want to with. And it's silence coming back oftentimes. So, it's not like we're getting these kudos on a weekly basis from people. We get downloads, but we have no idea if people actually like those downloads, how much they're listening to those downloads, whether they were like, oh, this is crap, I'm moving on to the next thing, or, we don't know. None of that data existed for us. So those little moments were pretty powerful.
I liked how one of the other things that you had talked about a little bit earlier in the conversation was the importance of, or how this started. It was conversations that you were having with each other. And then before long, it was, wow, there's a lot of value. We should just record this. There's a lot of value that people can get out of that. And I think there's a challenge that a lot of people have out there where they think they're the only one struggling with a given challenge, whatever that challenge is. There's this bit of isolation, especially as you go through the last 2 years that we've gone through. And I've worked with people who've joked that COVID didn't happen in Arizona because we've kind of have had the state open, so to speak, for the majority of the time. But let's talk about the value of having conversations with other people, whether or not someone gets a chance to hear those. Let's just talk about getting to know people, getting to have a conversation, being vulnerable with people, asking questions, being open to taking on coaching, being a good listener. What did you learn over the 432 some odd episodes about asking questions, listening, engaging with others that others would be surprised to hear that that's a learning lesson, or might be surprised to say, wow, that's not novel. That's kind of normal. And that's a rough question, but it's more of this whole idea of the importance of interacting with people, the importance of having conversation, the importance of asking questions, the importance of listening, the importance of putting yourself out there, even without recording it.
Yeah.
Christie, why don't you take this first?
So I'm going to take it in a couple of steps here. So the first is that, I actually went through coaching certification during our podcast time period. So that really informed a lot of our discussions as well. And of course, coaching is all about empathy. It's all about active listening. It's about how do you focus your attention on the client across the table from you and make sure everything is about them and not about you imposing your ideas or ideals on them, right? So there's some really incredible learning that I took away from that, and I think that happened. Yeah, I think what I've said often is that I didn't become a coach to be a better salesperson, but I am most certainly a better salesperson because I became a coach. And it is all about that level of active listening. So, one of the things that you'll see oftentimes from, when you listen to the podcast is that, Jeff and I might have a lot of experience in a particular topic, but the podcast isn't often about us sharing that experience. It's about interviewing the person on the other side of the table about their experience with that topic. And then offering some of our own perspectives. But what happens is sometimes the things that you think you know the most about are the things you're most closed to when interacting with somebody else or when having a conversation. So I think I learned to be a little bit more humble in that regard, and vulnerability is so powerful. So that's one element of it. The other element that I would say, especially as it relates to podcasting and marketing, and this is somewhat related to your question about active listening and what you get from that experience. Early on, we talked a lot about what if we'd made our target list and then we invited that target list on the podcast, because now I'm not coming in and I'm not telling you all the things that you like. Here's why I'm such a great coach and you need to work with me. I'd like to bring you onto the podcast and let you talk about the things that are important to you, the things that you do well in your organization, so that we can develop that camaraderie, that connection. And then if that leads to something in business, that's great. But utilizing the podcast interview as an opportunity to prospect, bring your prospect on, let them talk about the things that are important to them. Best prospecting conversation you're ever going to have. So companies are missing an opportunity if they're not taking advantage of that. So those, I know the second one was a little bit off the beaten path, but I wanted to get it in before I forgot.
I think
because that happens.
I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but we used to try so hard to make sure that we didn't sound stupid, that we tried to contrive some of the conversations, and those weren't our best conversations. And so we'd have this shared document. Here are the 3 things we want to make sure we ask.
Right.
Christie, you go, then I'll go, then you go. We'll flip the order next time. And then I think you realize that you're stifling your best self when you feel like the next logical thing to ask is this, but your sheet says something else. And so there's this conflict of, do I go where my intuition tells me to go? And your intuition doesn't tell you to go anywhere you don't really want to go, right? Like where you're not interested in going. And you're like, but the show notes say I have to do this. And it's like, okay, you start to question, is this really do we need to really keep doing this? And then I think it was season 4. I keep saying seasons. I think it was our 4th year where it was like, well, let's just press record right away, because the stuff that we talk about before we start the interview is really, really good.
Yeah.
We called those our green room kind of conversations, and we actually released those on a playlist for a little bit. And that, I think, just reinforced that we didn't need to do a whole lot of production. We didn't need to do a whole lot of preparation ahead of time. When you look up to someone, when you admire something that someone is doing, when you're curious to learn more, just show up and talk.
Right.
And so you can trust yourself. And that led me to epiphanies about sales calls and discovery calls and prospecting and everything, which further, edifies my stance that you can't go out there and just look for the best way to do something. You have to think instead about what needs to happen and then identify your own best way of going about accomplishing those things, whether it's a sales process or project management or whatever. Like, how to do this. Quit insisting on training wheels and show up and be your best self and be okay with whatever that is, and then improve it where you see fit. Because we didn't, as soon as we got rid of those training wheels, and Christie, I know you'll agree with this, as soon as we got rid of those training wheels, our show got a lot better. as did every other conversation I had in my life.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, it's amazing what ends up happening when you just are you, when you're not, you have a natural conversation. We all have this ability to have a natural conversation with folks, like at a dinner table. I grew up in a family of 7 kids. It was loud around the dinner table and food disappeared quickly. But you learn, people didn't come to a dinner table with a scripted set of questions that they were going to ask. And nor did someone stand up and start banging on the table and say, no, this is what we need to do next. Like there was just this active engagement that was happening throughout. And I mean, you think about it in the context of these, a discovery call or any kind of call that we have with someone where you put your needs in front of the other person and say, no, I have to go through my 5 to 10 or 20 questions of business fit or my 6 qualification questions so that you go through this gauntlet. And now all you've really done is checked various boxes rather than get to know the person on the other end. And I think, and this was one of the things we were talking about, I think earlier, because I don't remember if it was in the conversation or not, but the starting to take away things so that you can focus attention on the other things that are important. You take away, slow things down so that you can move a lot faster rather than feel like, oh, this has got to go to this, to this, to this, to this, to this. And I think it's pretty powerful when you start to have conversations with multiple people. And I'm sure you've seen this over the 432 some odd episodes. You have all these conversations. You start to realize, wow, there's some consistent patterns in themes that are coming up, but the language is not always the same in every instance because the experiences are slightly different. However, the themes are consistent. And there's some power in the learning that can happen when you can engage with people who have a different set of experiences, but have ultimately overcome some of the same challenges. And I think it all really kind of comes back to we're human beings. We want to have a house where people feel comfortable coming back home to, whether that's a house or an apartment or a tent, whatever it is. But you want your family to be comfortable coming back and congregating in a place. And when they congregate in that place, you want them to feel safe. And when they leave that place, you want them to have said, wow, that was an enjoyable experience. I want to do it again. Well, it's not all that different in the way that you work with customers. And if it is, I would suggest you're doing something wrong.
So true.
Jeff, Christie, as always, it's a great conversation. Thank you for the work that you did on the why and the buy over the period of time, going to 430 some odd episodes, 432, as Jeff reminded me earlier today. Thank you for doing it. Where can people find out what you're working on? Where would you like to send people to?
You can find me in 2 different places. Well, 3 different places now. JeffBajorek.com, really simple. RethinkTheWayYouSell.com, which is my online community where, it's free to enter, but you're connecting like-minded people who are looking to become better salespeople. And I've got a podcast called the Rethink the Way You Sell podcast, which launched sometime in mid-February. As we're recording this, it's going to launch sometime in mid-February. So when you hear this, it's probably already out there. But what I learned from the why and the buy is I really like the podcast format. What I learned from having multiple podcasts is that multiple podcasts is too many. And what I've learned from all this focus is a way to really put a lot of my ideas and my writing and my content into a certain format. And this is a rather ambitious project that I'm excited about and a little bit scared of, but you can check that out as well.
Excellent. Best place to find me is on LinkedIn. So Christie Walters on LinkedIn is probably the best place. And send me a note. I'm happy to engage. You'll find I'm not super active on social media, but I am on LinkedIn pretty regularly. So, and Mike, I just want to say too, thank you very much for everything. You've been an incredible friend and colleague over these last few years. And, a lot of people don't see the behind the scenes stuff as we kind of talk back and forth between the 2 podcasts and a lot of the similar journey I know that you've been on as well these last few years. So thanks for having us on.
Thank you. And we wouldn't have met had you not had the podcast.
Yeah.
True. So it's pretty cool to have a catalyst like that, a podcast that can make it easy to access people. Then once you have a conversation, you realize like to learn more about these people and actually have conversations that go far beyond what would maybe put on tape. So thank you both. If you know of anybody who would find value in listening to this podcast, please share it with them on LinkedIn, Twitter, comment to Jeff and I on Twitter, to Christie, Jeff and I on LinkedIn. Sales is a thinking process. How are you thinking differently about yours?